Hey everybody, Ray here, and in today's video I want to focus on the update for my Fury Bash Barbarian build. I'm calling it Dual Bash because we are still using the Dual Wield, but I made some changes for the build to push even further. Right now I already completed at least 128 push, and I think I can do up to 130 if you spend enough time rolling bosses and preparing for the runs. And also your items are upgraded and have a pretty nice GA. So I want to showcase what I changed and how you can make your build stronger that way as well. Generally, after the patch, it's a pretty great idea to stack Vulnerable in the most builds, because Vulnerable is buffed right now, it's a new hot thing, and it can bring the build's damage to much higher numbers. So we changed a few things and approaches about the build itself. First off, I changed the Amulet need to the X because I think X is an amazing option for it. Generally, it rolls Bash, STR, maximum life and critical strike damage. It also opens a possibility to add at least one more aspect to a classical build. And that aspect should be Bolt Chieftain aspect, because Bolt Chieftain always been amazing. I never used it because I never had enough space, but right now it's definitely a possibility. On top of that, we are going to use a Paingorgers, because if you're not really focusing on crit damage, we can get Paingorgers and benefit from them. Paingorgers bonus is not working for critical strike damage at all, because it's not really considers your crits. However, vulnerable damage buffing your Paingorger damage, which is an amazing approach to make our damage much higher. On top of that, I changed almost all my weapons to vulnerable damage too, that way our sword goes STR and vulnerable, and the mace goes STR and vulnerable as well. Since we are going to use the Paingorgers, we are using damage while berserkering bonus, and it's pretty important to roll it on the two-handed now. And right now we just don't have a lot of options on top of that. Moving forward, I also changed the rings. For the rings I just changed one, and it's pretty important to get GA attack speed here. For attack speed breakpoint we currently have 52% approximate, and perfectly need to go to 54 and higher. So 22 from the ring together with 22 for Paingorgers bring us to 44, and on top of that having at least 11.6 on the rings brings me to 53% of attack speed. It helps us a lot to bypass some frame limits that our build currently have with the attack speed approach. And I think it works much better, because right now we can attack much faster as well. It also helps pretty significantly to get vulnerable damage everywhere, as I already mentioned, and I also rerolled some of my weapons to double hit bash. If you can do that, feel free to do that, because it could help you significantly as well. The next step is pretty much changing the Amulet. I think counter-offensive is an amazing bonus at the Amulet, since we're fortified pretty consistently, and it can give about 12% of multiplicative damage, which is just awesome. And I also think that it's pretty important to get STR under GA here, because that way we can get much more STR in the build by itself. Critical strike chance could be changed to cooldown reduction, both of them work just fine, but I have critical here and I think it's working well too. We are still rolling important presence and damage to close enemies. On top of that, we will need to have a life changes, because with all that setup I have only 65,000 of life, because I changed all the gems in the gear to STR gems. As you can see, both in my chest and my helmet and in pants I have STR gems, and I recommend it for a higher push. It's really a great idea to do that. So 65k life is pretty much what we currently have, and on top of that we can buff anti-venin to reach 78k, and that's, well, a pretty decent approach. 78,000 of life are pretty much enough to push higher levels, because damage is not really getting higher, but amount of damage that you need to do to monsters and their survivability is much higher. So stacking damage is much more important, and I definitely recommend STR stones. And the last potion usually is Elixir of Fortitude, but for that case I think Elixir of Advantage is much a better option, because it raises our attack speed much higher. And all of that combined together will make our character to attack very fast in a rapid succession. Since we're utilizing Paingorgers, it's going to utilize our vulnerable bonus and stuff like that. I also recommend to roll Lucky Hit chance to make enemies vulnerable on the ring, because it will help to maintain vulnerable much more often than just using chains. If you don't have that buff, that's alright, you can just use your Steel Grasp to pretty much chain your enemies and get vulnerable for 3 seconds, but if you have that buff, it will be much more consistent and convenient to just have your vulnerable up at all times. So talking about the skill changes, we don't really change much. It's pretty much the same as Bash and Enchant's Bash. Moving forward as Martial Vigor, Imposing Presence. We are still using Iron Skin, well, because it's like the best ability for survivability. The biggest change is pretty much addition of Hamstring, because Hamstring gives us your bleeding effects slow healthy enemies by 20%. And I think it's just an amazing passive, because every time an enemy is bleeding, it will be slowed, and slowed enemies are considered crowd controlled. It's a pretty good bonus to pretty much utilize our No Mercy bonus, because it gives us all slowed enemies. That way we are receiving 9% critical strike chance against all the enemies that are pretty much hitting us, and I think it's a pretty awesome combination. Another change is pretty much addition of a Rupture. The only thing why we even need the Rupture in this build is just boosting our attack speed even further with Warrior's Rupture. I think it's much more consistent and it's here much more often than Call of the Ancients. Both of them are perfectly viable, but I think Rupture works better for higher push, because we just need to kill monsters faster, not just the boss. And for monsters, I think Rupture will provide better results because cooldown is much lower, especially since we have Shackle and it can give like 4 levels of Rupture by itself. So Rupture and Warrior Rupture could be used consistently just to get that attack speed bonus for 5 seconds, which is amazing. And Hamstring and No Mercy is just an awesome combination, so feel free to use it. I do not add much more points to Concussion, because I think 60% of chance that's perfectly alright, and Duelist is going to push our attack speed even higher, so take it in almost all cases. So talking about the Paragon, there are some changes but not a lot of them. The most important part is pretty much the Decimator. I changed the glyph here to Martial, I just moved Martial there. And they're taking both Arrogance and Demolish. So since we need to stack vulnerable damage to raise our Paingorgers damage, it's a pretty nice idea to just take all magic nodes around for vulnerable. On top of that, in the last board, I'm also moved Undaunted in there. So Undaunted here provides a pretty decent approach, with Iron Strength which buffs armor on top of that and basic armor here. In the left board, I'm using pretty much a Bonebreaker board, and I stack a lot of STR in there. On top of that, I'm also going for Tenacity, because Tenacity can provide a lot of maximum life, and since we are changing the stones in the build, that's a pretty important part to get that. I'm also taking both resistances, but if you are using incense and don't really need them, you can pretty much just drop those 2 points and change them for damage, for example, or for health here, which would be a pretty decent approach. And in the left board, we're not really taking anything additionally, the glyph is still Revenge, and that goes pretty much for the Carnage board. Here we're just taking Territorial in the same fashion as we did before. So everything is pretty much stays. And it's been just like changing glyphs around. So talking about resistances, most of the time you should have at least 68 and 5% resistances. So perfectly you just need to roll resistances with double masterwork on your armor. If you can't achieve it, I recommend to roll a second option of resistances, first on your armor and second on your boots, for example, instead of ASTR. So just roll plus to all resistances in that case. If you will be able to get like more resistances, you can always change the Paragon, like drop the 2 points that I mentioned. And on top of that, if you don't have that option but want to save point, you can always use Soothing Spice as a pretty nice bonus for 10% resistances for all elements. Because for level like level 110 for example, you don't need resistances like at all, but for higher level push you can always just use incense. However, if it's not really comfortable for you, try to get double masterwork or roll a second resistances on the boots. So talking about armor limits, it's pretty important to aim for at least 9100 armor. So right now I have 9156 armor without incense. Because with incense I'm going to have 9300 armor, which is pretty much the limit. It's pretty important to stay close with it. Most of the time we are receiving armor from our STR, so STR is pretty high. If you don't have such things as Amulet with pretty much GA STR, or just don't want to use stones in your items, it's pretty important to still use armor on the pants. So just reroll STR at the pants to the armor, and it's going to work just fine. But if you want to maximize your build and to get like everything to the maximum, it's still recommended to roll STR instead and just use STR, because you will still have capped armor if your other items are just like in a really good position. So generally changing the setup helped me to push up to 128 PIT, and I'm sure the build can do 130, 132 and something like that. It's much harder because you need to get a proper boss for the fight, and it pretty much slows down the process, so it comes to amount of the attempts. Right now I still think it's a pretty awesome result, considering they're using a different ways to increase the damage, and the build is clearing pretty stably. It can also speedrun with an amazing speed and should be pretty easy to farm stuff for all other builds that could be affected by this. Thank you very much for watching, and feel free to subscribe for more Diablo content. See you next time!